Ladies and gentlemen, in today's video, we're going to be counting down every single stadium that was used in the 2025 NRL season, counting them down all the way from the worst at number 26 through to the best at number 1. And we are going to be kicking things off in regional New South Wales in the town of Bathurst. We do have Carrington Park. It was used for one game earlier in the year. Not too much to say about this one. It is a typical regional ground. You do have one grandstand and basically a grass hill around the rest of the ground, but it is in a nice sort of regional setting, so there is sort of 1+ on that part. At number 25, we do move up to the Northern Territory to TIO Stadium in Darwin. This did host a game earlier in the year. I believe it was the Eels. This stadium really quite basic again. You do really just have the one major grandstand. It is in an oval configuration though, usually used for Aussie rules and cricket. And obviously with the humidity, the conditions are pretty tough, so I do mark it down for that. And really those oval grounds, you will say they are marked a little bit harsher than rectangular grounds in this list. And this thing only good enough for number 25. Next up, we do have another regional New South Wales ground. This one, Glen, Willow Oval in Mudgee. Again, another very basic ground, but I do like the grandstand in this one. It is a lot more modern than some of the other regional grounds. This one actually did host a game very recently, and it is quite nice in terms of the rectangular configuration. Not much going for it, but you do have sort of a double-decker grandstand with a pretty decent overhang, and it looks like some corporate boxes or some sort of commentary or coach's box there, so it does get a tick on that behalf. At number 23, it is the first of, I guess you could say, the more regular grounds. This one, Lyon Oval in Sydney. Of course, a very iconic venue, but famously this thing is pretty run down, pretty dilapidated. It does need an upgrade. Unfortunately, it is getting one in the next couple of years. It was announced last year, $40 million. They are going to be upgrading that major grandstand on the wing and also adding a new grandstand behind one of the goals, just upgrading the capacity, adding a few more amenities. And obviously, if it helps Leichhardt stick around for a lot longer, it is a big plus. But right now, in its current configuration, this stadium is very dated and very ordinary in terms of the facilities, only good enough for number 23. Next up, I have got Sharks Stadium in Cronulla, home of the Sharks, of course. This thing has had a little bit of development done in and around the ground in the last few years, but really it is just very basic. You do sort of have three pretty disjointed grandstands. There's not a lot of flow between the different stands, and obviously you do just have some grass hills in a lot of the parts of the ground, but it is very open, it's very exposed, and it is kind of just boring. I guess the one plus is obviously the location. You do have a nice view of the water, although that is sort of masked by the trees and some of that shrubbery between it and the water. But yeah, this stadium really pretty basic, not a massive fan of it, and I do have it at 22. At number 21, we do have Belmore, of course, the traditional home of the Bulldogs. This thing is a little bit less frequently used than some of the other suburban venues in Sydney, but honestly, it's not the worst. It is very reminiscent of like a 70s or 80s vibe with those grandstands, really just the one stand and sort of that ring of seating. But you do have the terraces behind both ends. Obviously, you got the train line as well, but it is sort of a bit of a throwback with the hill, with the surroundings, and it does sort of suit the Bulldogs as a sort of working class team. And it would be kind of cool to see a few more games here in the future. I do like the grandstand though, a bit bigger, a bit more grand than some of the other suburban grounds, but it is quite basic, you'd have to say again. We will stay in the west of Sydney. This one, Campbelltown Sports Stadium at number 20. One of the homes of the West Tigers, of course, with Leichhardt. Really, this stadium very bland. You do have the grey seats. You do basically just have one covered grandstand and a sort of exposed grandstand on the broadcast side, and then really just two grass hills behind either end. Obviously, the grey seats, the sort of semi-modern stadium built in probably the 80s or 90s. Not a lot of charm to it. The location, again, pretty basic. It is sort of just in a suburban setting where you do have some roads and a few other things around it, but really nothing scenic or nothing really too appealing about this one. We do move up to Queensland for number 19. It is TIO Stadium in Redcliffe. Of course, this is one of the Dolphins' home grounds, but really a minor home ground, obviously, with most of their games played in the much bigger Suncorp Stadium. pretty small capacity, only around 11,500, but it does kind of have a little bit of an atmosphere here. You do have sort of 3 distinct stands. It is a little bit more built up and intimate maybe than some of the other suburban grounds. And obviously you have the Leagues Club or the restaurant sort of area behind one of the ends. It is a kind of unique factor. You don't really see that at many other grounds. It would be nice maybe for the Dolphins to play here a few more times. Maybe if they put a little bit of money into the ground, build it up to 15, 16K, you might be able to have 4 or 5 games here. But the Dolphins do obviously draw pretty well at Suncorp, but hopefully they do still continue to play a couple of games a year in Redcliffe. Of course, that is their traditional heartland. Even if the team isn't actually called the Redcliffe Dolphins, it is kind of cool to see those roots remaining. At number 18, we do go across the ditch to, I guess, the more minor of the New Zealand venues. This one, Apollo Project Stadium in Christchurch on the South Island. We have seen the NRL and the Warriors playing here for quite a few years now. This stadium, of course, really just a temporary stadium. It was pretty much built up after the earthquake in the early 2010s when the previous stadium was basically destroyed in the earthquake. Never really been a big fan of this stadium. Obviously, you'd understand it is a temporary stadium, so it's not going to be the most aesthetic or really the most impressive, but it is basically pretty generic, and it does have that sort of cheap pop-up look. No doubt we won't be seeing this one much longer, certainly in the NRL. The new stadium being built over in Christchurch with the translucent roof, really modern, really impressive, and I'm sure the Warriors would want to be playing 1 or 2 games a year there once it is built. It is due to open in 2026, so potentially could we see a game there maybe later in the season in 2026, and potentially could we see a South Island team in the NRL down the track potentially. I did make a video on that. There has been a number of sort of suggestions and bids put together, but obviously the NRL's committed to PNG, to Perth. Maybe they'll look at another New Zealand team or another Queensland team in terms of that 20th side. But it would be kind of cool to see that stadium used in the NRL regardless. I'm sure the Warriors would be pretty keen to play there as they move on from this old stadium in Christchurch. At number 17, we do go back to suburban Sydney, up to the Northern Beaches, and it is Four Pines Park, aka Brookvale Oval in Manly. Now this stadium, really a few years ago, it was very decrepit, was falling apart. It would be a lot lower on the list, but I really do like the renovation they did behind one of the goals there. Stand with the overhang, a little corporate box sort of entertaining area, and it is quite a nice little addition. It does enclose that end of the ground. It does make it a lot more intimate, but they did keep the hill, of course, and some of the older grandstands on the other parts of the ground. It does tie the ground together pretty well. Obviously, it does have a bit of a vibe about it, a bit of an atmosphere, and it is a good home ground for the Sea Eagles. And again, they are talking about putting a bit more money into this place over the next few years, so potentially we could see it climb up a little bit higher in the future. At number 16, we do go to Canberra, TIO Stadium, home of the Raiders, of course. Not much to say about this one. It is very, very outdated at this point. Obviously very exposed, which doesn't really augur well when you think of Canberra, when you think of the freezing conditions. It is sort of built below ground level, so you do get that effect in winter to where the cold air sort of just sits on the playing surface. Not a very nice experience for fans. Obviously, we know the Raiders and the rugby union team, the Brumbies, have been going on about getting either a big time renovation or a new stadium in Canberra for the past 10 or 15 years. Government there has sort of been dragging its feet in terms of getting the ball rolling on either one of those plans. And potentially we could see maybe the money going towards a AFL team or a redevelopment of Manuka Oval to host AFL and BBL cricket. And it would sort of be a shame to see the rectangular sports neglected to where all the money goes to the oval sports and the oval stadium. This thing really hasn't changed much since the 2000s, where it was converted into a rectangular configuration. You can sort of see the footprint of the old oval stadium, and obviously with the minimal cover and sort of the exposed nature of it, really not a great venue, you'd have to say, in Canberra. At number 15, I have got HBF Park in Perth. This thing hosting a game earlier in the year, and of course it will be the new home ground of the Perth Bears when they come into the NRL in a couple of years' time. Honestly, this stadium is pretty good. You do have quite a bit of it that was built in the last 10 or 15 years with that bigger stand on the outer wing and obviously that smaller one behind the goals. The rest of the ground is pretty old at this point. This thing, also like GIO Stadium, Stadium in Canberra was converted from an oval ground into a rectangular configuration around 20 or 30 years ago. But it does have a bit of a charm. It is pretty decent in terms of the new parts of the ground, but some of the amenities in those older areas, not the best. You do have the shed as well behind one of the ends. Hopefully that'll be a feature for the Bears when they do end up coming in. But it will be cool to see this stadium potentially getting a bit more work done to it. Maybe they'll look to upgrade that older grandstand on the broadcast side before the Bears do come into the NRL. But it will be good to see a lot more rugby league in Western Australia in the future. Next up, we do have Jubilee Stadium in Kogarah at number 14. This is home of the Dragons, of course. And you might think this thing rated a little bit highly. I do sort of like the oval configuration here. It is compact enough to where you're not a million miles away from the action or rectangular sports, but it is quite built up to where there's minimal sort of hill area and a pretty impressive grandstand as well on the broadcast side, and quite a bit of seating as well, which is a positive. It is also in a sort of charming suburban setting, which does sort of add to the atmosphere of the place. It is nice seeing this thing packed out on a Sunday arvo. Maybe the one criticism obviously would be that dead sort of area, given it is an oval sort of ground, and maybe the exposed nature of it, not very nice in cold or wet conditions. But overall, this is probably one of the better suburban Sydney venues in the NRL, you'd have to say. At number 13, it is the other home ground of the Dragons, WIN Stadium in Wollongong. Again, quite a unique ground. It does have a decent capacity, around 20k. You do really have 3 significant grandstands, and also the hill, of course, the feature on the outer wing as you look at it on TV. They did a good job with that newer grandstand that was built around 15 years ago on the broadcast side. And it is quite a built-up ground, basically for a second tier, I guess you could say, NRL venue. Obviously, the highlight, the view out to the ocean over the hill. It is a great feature of the stadium. You do sort of have the beach in the background and sort of a few trees around the stadium as well. But it is kind of cool to see how built up it is, and really the double-decker nature of the stands is a plus. Maybe it is a bit of a shame this thing not used a little bit more often, but I do have it at number 13 on the list. Moving on to number 12, again in the regional areas of New South Wales, this thing, Polytech Stadium, aka the Central Coast Stadium. Another secondary sort of home ground. The NRL has played quite a few games over the years here. And really this stadium, very impressive for a second tier NRL ground. It is a lot more built up than a lot of the other secondary venues. Obviously with the continuous nature, it does sort of have the common design language between all the stands. It does seat around 20,000. You do have double-decker grandstands on both of the wings with a little bit of cover there on the major grandstands. Obviously the feature of this stadium is the view over the water, the open end behind one of the goals with the palm trees. It is kind of a cool vibe, although it is a little bit unique. And maybe this stadium, although it's not new, the most recent redevelopment being around 20 or 30 years ago, it does sort of feel a bit more modern than some of the other grounds, and they have done a pretty good job with the construction of it, and it doesn't really feel like it needs any major work going forward. Maybe we'll see the Bears play a game or two here when they do come in, although obviously now the Bears will be located primarily in Perth, but it is a cool option for the NRL maybe to play a couple of games a year here going forward. Number 11, I have got Go Media Stadium, aka Mount Smart Stadium in Auckland, home of the Warriors. Bit hard to know where to rank this thing. It does have a decent capacity, 30k. It does have a pretty good atmosphere when the Warriors do sell it out, as they have been doing over the past 3 or 4 years. But it is very dated and really disjointed. It does feel like the fans are a long way back from the action. You do have that big exposed grandstand behind one of the goals, and then obviously the hill behind the other goal, although it is a long way back from the action. And it does sort of have that below ground level feel to it, which feels incredibly dated and really a bit bland. You would kind of like to see the Warriors potentially getting a new stadium, or at least a significant upgrade. Obviously rugby league making big inroads into the New Zealand market. Great crowds, great sort of buy-in from the public, and maybe they should be rewarded with a better stadium. Potentially if Eden Park gets an upgrade, maybe the Warriors could move into that, although maybe they're not quite ready for a 55-60k stadium. But it would be good to see this thing getting an upgrade because, as I said, it does feel incredibly dated and it does really stick out when you look at some of the better grounds in the NRL. Number 10, it is McDonald Jones Stadium in Newcastle, getting into, I guess, the better sort of tier NRL grounds at this point. Really no major issues with this stadium. Very good capacity of 33k. The Knights are obviously very popular when they're going well. They do get some good crowds. This stadium as well, pretty decent. You do have obviously the major two grandstands on the wing, which is a very common design. Decent amount of cover with those overhangs. And obviously some people will like the hills. I'm probably not a massive fan of it. I would maybe like to see those filled in with seating in the future, although the capacity as it is pretty good for the Knights. And really 33k is heaps of capacity for Newcastle. Although maybe if the FIFA World Cup or another big event came to Australia in the future, this is probably one of the grounds they would look at upgrading. Of course, Newcastle is a pretty decently sized city and certainly it would be considered for some of those major events. But those hills are probably the only knock you'd have on this stadium at this point. Number 9, it is Cbus Super Stadium, home of the Gold Coast Titans. A pretty basic stadium, one deck all the way around really. You do have that nice roof, which is a plus. Does sort of have that Gold Coast vibe, the blue and yellow seats. And the roof is pretty good as well, almost like a mini Suncorp Stadium. It does feel like, I do like how it's a continuous roof around the stadium. The only knock on this thing, probably it is a little bit bland, but it is probably fit for purpose for the Titans. Obviously not a massive drawing team, and it does get the job done when you look at the NRL. Really no need for any upgrades on this thing. It was only built in around 2008, so they should get another 10 or 15 years out of this thing before it does need a bit of work. At number 8, I do have Optus Stadium in Perth. Obviously, if you're ranking this thing purely on the facilities and I guess the grandiose nature of it, probably 1 or 2, but it is, again, an AFL/cricket ground. It is in the oval configuration. Obviously, for events like Origin, rugby games, bigger sort of soccer games as well, it does the job. When you do have a full house, it is a great atmosphere and it doesn't really matter too much that it is in an oval configuration. But when you do just have regular NRL games where they only get 20 or 30,000 people in, it does sort of fall short a bit and the atmosphere is not great. But obviously the facilities, you can't fault it, built only in 2018, and it does have a really nice capacity of 60,000 for those bigger events. Obviously the Bears, you'd think maybe they'll play some of the bigger games and the finals here going forward, but I hope they don't overuse this stadium because it is a shame to see it only with 10 or 15,000 in. It doesn't really do it justice. But can't fault the stadium, just not really an NRL ground. Moving on to number 7, Accor Stadium, the Olympic Stadium in Sydney. Again, like Optus, a lot of the issues with this thing are the same. It is way too big for regular season NRL games. It is great for Origin and some of those bigger events, but really this thing only fills out once or twice a year in terms of rugby league. When you do only have 10 or 15,000 in for a regular NRL game on like a Thursday night, it's not a great experience. Way too big with over 80,000 seats. Obviously the grandstands, the way they're built, it was an oval stadium which has sort of been converted into a rectangular stadium. But you are a long way back from the action and the incline and steepness of the grandstands are really poor. So you do feel like you're a long way back when you are at the ground. They did a good job with the new video screens they put in a few years ago, but it would have been kind of cool to see maybe that roof being installed over the playing surface that they were talking about pre-COVID, or potentially just bulldozing the thing and rebuilding on the site. Of course, Sydney does need a big time 80,000 seat plus stadium for those big events, big concerts. But this thing being built back in 1999, it does show its age. And you got to wonder what the future for this is over the next 20 or 30 years. At number 6, we do move into probably the top tier NRL stadiums. You'd have to say this one, CommBank Stadium in Parramatta, opening back in 2019 where it was rebuilt on the original Parramatta Stadium site. With this stadium, you can't really fault it. Obviously, it is so new. The amenities are top tier. It does sort of have that European soccer style stadium feel where you have the lower deck being pretty small and then obviously the bigger upper deck. You do have the big overhang roof around the majority of the ground and that one wing being for the corporates and the media. Really top tier stadium, does the job, 30,000 seats. Home of the Eels and of course the Panthers while their stadium is getting rebuilt. The one knock on this thing, probably the exterior. It is really ugly and exposed, but it was actually built for a pretty cheap cost when you compare it to some of the other stadiums that have been built in Australia in the past 10 or so years. So really no complaints about this stadium, and it is a very solid entry at number 6. At number 5, one of my personal favourites, Queensland Country Bank Stadium in Townsville, home of the Cowboys. Love this stadium, love the vibes, love the roof design, the opening roof towards the city of Townsville. Love the seat colour with that Cowboys sort of blue, gold and white colour scheme. Very nice capacity of 25,000. The roof is fantastic. It does cover most of the seats, and obviously that's very important in a hot environment like Townsville. And sometimes you can criticise stadiums where the seats are exposed, but it is kind of cool how they've done it with the exposed end towards the city, and also the roof, how it sort of trails off into the apron of the stadium. Really fantastic job with this thing, cannot fault it. And you could argue, well, it is probably one of the top 2 or 3 regional stadiums in Australia. At number 4, we do go down to Melbourne, Amy Park, home of the Storm. This thing built back in 2010. It holds around 30,000 people. Very unique stadium with that iconic bubble roof. And it is easy to forget this thing is actually 15 years old, so it's not really new out of the box anymore. But it is a fantastic ground. It does look really good on TV. And from the exterior, do have those unique light towers. Good viewing experience for the fans where they are pretty close into the action. It is a pretty atmospheric stadium as well with that overhanging roof. Really locks in the sound and the acoustics. Maybe the one knock on this is the green seats, and it does sort of clash with the purple colour scheme of the Storm, but really you're nitpicking there. It is a fantastic ground, and it should be good to go for the next at least 15-20 years before it needs a minor renovation. At number 3, I have got Suncorp Stadium in Brisbane, maybe a little bit controversial. It is probably the most iconic rugby league ground on the planet. Does have a fantastic capacity, 52,000. Great atmosphere, of course, we know, particularly for Origin, and also for the Broncos, and to a lesser extent, the Dolphins. Obviously, you've got Magic Round here, very iconic venue, but it is probably in need of a bit of work in terms of a renovation. Hasn't really had anything done to it since the Rugby World Cup in 2003, where they sort of linked up all the grandstands and built that nice roof. I do like the roof, how it is a little bit exposed and does let the natural light in and some of the weather in terms of the wind, certainly to cool you down in a hot environment. But it is a little bit dated when you compare it to some of the better, newer NRL stadiums and also other types of stadiums in Australia. Maybe they look at giving this thing a little bit of love before the Olympics in 2032. It won't be a major renovation, you wouldn't have thought, with the new Victoria Park Stadium obviously costing nearly $3 billion, but maybe you could do a little bit of a facelift, just upgrade some of the amenities and maybe the exterior of this stadium to keep it going strong as such a famous rugby league ground. And at number 2, I have got Allianz Stadium in Moore Park. Of course, the Sydney Football Stadium rebuilt in 2022 for $828 million. This did get a lot of criticism at the time. Did the old Sydney Football Stadium really need to get knocked down? You could argue maybe not, but obviously you can't really argue with what they've built. It is a fantastic ground, really awesome atmosphere, beautiful design to where it sort of honours the old school Sydney Football Stadium with that curved arch sort of roof. And they have provided a lot more cover behind the goals as well. It is a very intimate design, really nice, tight feel to it. Bit of a shame we don't get some bigger crowds here for regular season NRL games, but when it is full, it is one of the top tier stadiums in terms of Australia. I love the blue sort of seat design. I love the roof particularly, and the exterior with that sort of chrome or copper style wrapping. I guess you could say the facade around the stadium looks really good, and it really pops against the white roof. And obviously the white roof as well goes really well with the SCG next door, or at least the newer stands at the SCG. And really just a fantastic viewing stadium, fantastic amenities, fantastic comforts for fans, world class in terms of the amenities. And this stadium is certainly one of the better ones in the NRL, and I do have it at number 2, although I don't have it at number 1. At number 1, it is Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas. And you can argue, well, this isn't really an NRL stadium, but it did obviously host the Vegas games. And when you look at the amenities and sort of the world class class, cutting edge nature of it. It is a lot further advanced than anything in Australia. You do have that enclosed roof with the semi-opaque sort of translucent design where it does let in a little bit of natural light, but it doesn't let in the full amount. Obviously in a desert environment it will be too hot. You do get that window out to the strip and obviously the flame there. It is of course an NFL stadium, primarily home of the Las Vegas Raiders, only built a couple of years ago. You do have the 65,000 seat capacity, and really the comfort level of this thing is second to none. Certainly when you talk about the NRL and the stadiums that are used in the NRL in Australia. The one knock obviously is maybe the dimensions, where you can't fit a full-size rugby league pitch in it. Maybe it does get marked down a little bit for that. But if we are purely looking at the stadium and the comforts and the bleeding edge technology, this thing is heads and shoulders above anything in Australia, and it is the best NRL stadium that was used in the 2025 NRL season. That is all we're going to have time for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.